The mitzvahs of Shemittah and Hakhel go hand in hand. Both of them engender within us the attitude that we as Jewish people are supposed to have to ourselves and our engagement in the world and the assets that engagement provides for us. We're going to see all of that based on how Rashi explains the timing of Hakhel. The beginning of the instruction about the mitzvah of Hakhel, the Torah tells us, I'm not going to translate those words right now because Rashi is going to do so. Rashi quotes out of that pasuk as Hatevis the words Mikate Sheva Shanim, which means at the end of 7 years. Rashi explains as follows, that means B'shana Rishona Shel Shemittah. It's the first year of the new Shemittah 7-year cycle. Shehi Shana Shminis, which is in fact the 8th year if we compare it to the previous Shemittah cycle. Why then does the pasuk call it the year of Shemittah if it's the year after Shemittah? And he explains because technically there are laws of Shemittah that still apply. Because the halachas of Shemittah still apply to a harvest of produce that grew during the Shemittah year that you're not allowed to eat even though now the Shemittah year is over. Pashtus Nira. So what's Rashi trying to address? It would appear. The question Rashi looks to address apparently is the Sheina Kosav. The language of the pasuk is Mikei Sheva Shanim, which means at the end, V'soif Sheva Shanim Atzman. That it sounds like Hakhel is supposed to happen at the end of the 7th year of the Shemittah. Hani V'soif Hashana Shvis. As well as the fact that the Torah also says in the season of Shemittah. Hani V'shnasa Shemittah Atzma, again implying that Hakhel should occur in the Shemittah year. But then the pasuk says, when does it happen? In the holiday of Sukkot, which is not the end of the 7th year. It's already now the beginning of the next year. That would appear to be the difficulty that Rashi is addressing. To which Rashi explains, Rashi explains, it's the end of the Shemitah year when we now begin the 8th year, which is in fact the beginning of the next cycle. Pirush, in other words, even though the meaning of the word miketz does mean end, as Rashi already established for us in the beginning of Pashas Miketz, where he says, Kol Loshan Kate Soifu. Anytime the word Kate is used, it's the end of something. Nevertheless, says Rashi, in this specific context, the end means after the end. After you have ended the Shemitah, then once you finish the 7 years, you're now in the beginning of the 8th year, that's when you're going to have the mitzvah of Hakhel. Omno, that's what it would seem to be. But then Rashi says, but hang on a second, the pasuk says it's supposed to happen in the season of Shemitah, which sounds like it is in the Shemitah year. Therefore, Rashi adds the question, so why are you calling the 8th year, which is the beginning of a new Shemitah cycle? Why are you calling it the Shemitah year, which sounds like it's the end of the first cycle? And he says, because of technical reasons, because some of the halachas of Shemitah still apply. So it would appear to be what Rashi is doing, explaining the words that don't seem to be so clear. The only thing is there are two questions that arise. Number one, Aleph. If Rashi is explaining that the words Chag HaSukkos are part of the problem that he has to clarify, he should have included those words in his title. Or at least to allude to the words Chag HaSukkos by putting in etc. Because these are the words that stimulate the question we have, when exactly are we talking about? Secondly, if Rashi does want to explain to us over here that the word miketz, which always means the end, over here means after the end, as opposed to what you would have thought it means, that it's actually at the end, then he should have just said, it's the 8th year, and then we'd know. Okay, so after the 7 years are over, now it's the 8th year. Why does Rashi have to tell us that this 8th year is the beginning of the 7-year cycle? Beginning is a problematic word when you're talking about miketz, which means the end. That expression that it's the beginning of the next cycle does not fit with the word miketz. Doesn't help us to understand the pasuk. So what is Rashi telling us? That's actually how you find it in the Gemara Sota, which says that it does refer to the Hakhel as the 8th or the 8th year, without saying that it's the first year of the new cycle of Shemitah. So why is Rashi, in a sense, it would appear confusing us? Unless, of course, Rashi is not just simply addressing this question of how do you work out which time Hakhel is supposed to be. So we'll try a different explanation. Perhaps we could address at least the second question by saying that actually Rashi is reinterpreting the word mikates for us as he is reinterpreting the expression sheva shanim, 7 years. And in doing so, Rashi would discredit a potential misunderstanding we could have of the pasuk. So, Lule Pirush Rashi, if we didn't have Rashi's explanation, we would have thought, then we know the word Mikates means the end, we'd think it means at the end of the entire Shemittah year. In other words, the end of that series of 7 years. When you have finished the cycle of 7 years, so you'd say, when you're finishing the cycle of 7 years, and now you're in the 7th year of that cycle at the time of Sukkot, that is when you should do Hakhel. And we'd completely misunderstand the date of Hakhel. And maybe Rashi Sholel Zois, Rashi wants to negate that by telling us that this time when the word mikates is used, it's an unusual use of the word mikates. That in this specific scenario, mikates does not mean the end, but rather the beginning. As by the way, other of the Mefarshim do explain mikates, that it could be either end of a cycle, and that's what Rashi is telling us, that actually it's referring over here to the beginning of the 7 years that are coming. But if you are going to squeeze in to suggest that Rashi is telling us that Mikates over here does not mean what Mikates usually means, well, then the question goes the other way. Then why does he have to tell us it's the 8th year? If all he wants to tell us is it's the 1st year of the next cycle, which specifically makes this year appear as a continuation of the previous Shemitah year. Why would he do that? Most importantly, if Rashi was making such a radical statement that the word mikates here means something different to mikates everywhere else in Tanakh, he should have stated it in a way that I'm telling you new information. Where he's saying, even though I'm the one who taught you that kates always means an end, this is an exception. And he would have had to prove it. He doesn't do that. Plus, the language Rashi should have used, the style should have been as if he's explaining the meaning of the word. Mikate Sheva Shanim means Shana Rishon Shemittah. But the fact that Rashi says that Hakhel is in the 1st year of the new cycle of Shemittah implies he's not explaining the meaning of the word Mikate, but rather he's telling us when the time frame of Hakhel is. In the beginning of the new Shemitah cycle, which is the 8th year, coming from the previous Shemitah cycle. In other words, I'm not explaining the word, I'm explaining the time. Plus, there's another big question to ask over here, and that is, why did the pasuk even tell us that Hakhel is in the time of Shemitah? If it's not, if it's the beginning of the new cycle, if it's the 8th year, why does the pasuk associate it dafka with Shemitah? Which Rashi then has to explain, means that what's going on over here is because some of the halachas of Shvius still apply, that if there is harvest from the previous year, which was Shemitah, you cannot eat it this year. First of all, the principle halachically that you may not eat the produce of the previous Shemitah year when it's now the 8th year, something we already know, at least according to one view. Earlier on, where the Torah tells us that during Shemitah, you have to desist from plowing and harvesting. So we already know this information. You don't need it over here. But besides that, a much bigger question of Cholofen. What has the laws of Shemitah, even if there are practically laws of Shemitah that affect the next year, what has it got to do with Hakhel? You're telling me Hakhel has its own laws. Why do you have to talk about Shemitah when you talk about Hakhel? Speak about Shemitah when you deal with Shemitah, and talk about Hakhel when you're dealing with Hakhel. So the explanation is this. And Rashi Zokul the Pirish Tevis Mikate. Rashi does not have to explain the word Mikate. Kikvar Pirish Kanal, because as we've already mentioned, he explained in Parashas Mikate what it means. Kol Shekol Losh and Kate Soifu, that across the board Kate always means the end. And therefore, anytime you see the word Kate, or certainly Mikate, it's the same as the original time. It means the end. In our context, it means after or at the end of the cycle of 7 years of the Shemittah. We know that. Rashi doesn't have to explain it. Rather, Rashi is addressing a broader question about the timing of when Hakhel occurs. And generally speaking, that's what Rashi does. When you start or introduce a topic, he'll speak about things even if those issues are only going to arise later. Typically, Rashi explains a general principle about a concept when it is first introduced. Even if you're only going to become aware of the problem that Rashi is addressing later on when you find the psukim that speak to that problem. Because it's on this topic, it's in this parasha, it's something that's going to affect the entire understanding of this parasha. Rashi addresses it off the bat right at the beginning as the topic arises. Okay, with that introduction, let's go back to the example of Hakhel, to the issue of Hakhel. What is it that Rashi has to explain about the time? By way of introduction, we know very simply that in mitzvahs, you get two kinds of mitzvahs, those that have an explanation given in the Torah, and those that are left as irrational or super-rational mitzvahs that are not given an explanation. And then when a mitzvah is given an explanation, sometimes it's just about the general principle of the mitzvah, and sometimes about the specifics. So, from those mitzvahs that are given with a rational explanation, either because the Torah specified the reason, like, for example, because you were slaves in Mitzrayim, or where it's self-evident, like do not murder. It's still possible that you could have mitzvahs where the details and the specifics of the mitzvah are rational, and times where the mitzvah is rational, but the specifics are not necessarily rational. When it comes to Hakhel, the Torah tells us exactly why. What's the reason for the mitzvah? That people should come listen to the Torah and learn and come to fear the Eibishter. Which helps us to explain the details of how this mitzvah operates. When is Hakhel? It's when everybody comes together in the place that the Eibishter has chosen. Well, that makes sense, because if you need a gathering of the whole community, it makes sense to do it at a time when the community is gathering. And if you're in the Beis Hamikdash, which is the place that David just selected, then it's much more conducive to getting to a point of learning and understanding and fearing the Eibishter. So if the details are supposed to have a rational explanation, then some of the details need explanation. Why did the Torah say that the most appropriate time for Hakhel is straight after Shemittah? If the goal of Hakhel is to achieve a specific awareness, what awareness? Fear of the Eibishter. Which is the objective of Hakhel. Doesn't it make sense that if you're talking about instilling fear of the Eibishter, that should be at the beginning of, not at the end of a period? That's the broad question about Hakhel that Rashi needs to address. Why would Hakhel be at the end of a period? Rashi says, you know what, you're right. Even though the pasuk says Mikate, it's actually talking about the beginning of a new cycle, of the next Shemittah cycle. That's when Hakhel belongs, because it makes sense that if you're infusing people with fear of the Eibishter, it should be when they're about to begin a new cycle. You'll ask, then why does the pasuk say Mikate at the end of 7 years? Which implies that Hakhel is specifically at the end of, or at the very least a continuation of, Shemittah. Rashi says, yes, it is the 8th year, and that is part of how Hakhel works. Yes, it's important that this is the beginning of the new process that's going to lead and influence how we behave as Jewish people for the next 7 years. And it's equally important to know that is as a result of a continuation of what happened before the Shemittah. The whole power of Hakhel derives from the fact that it follows a Shemittah year. Let's explain how. What's Shemittah all about? Shnas Shmittah, it says, Shabbos in Yelo Eretz, it's a time of Shabbos for the land, Sod Choloi Sizr, V'cham Choloi Sizmor, that you may not harvest either your fields or your vineyards. Even the things that grow wild, etc., you cannot harvest for yourself. It is self-evident even at the pshat level that if the people are freed of the responsibilities of agriculture, which was their primary occupation, obviously they must have designated and dedicated their time to primarily learn Torah, which would have brought them to greater fear of Hashem and greater observance of mitzvahs. Same theme as Hakhel, right? To get people to fear the Eibishter and be committed to the Torah. Which explains a logical connection between Hakhel, which follows straight after Shemittah. Now you're starting the period where you're supposed to get back to the fields and start working again, and the vineyards. The first year of the agricultural cycle. We need a special arousal to get people to be focused in the correct manner with how they're going to go about their business over the next 6 years. Is that even when they're back in the fields working hard, it should be with a clarity and an attitude of fear of the Eibishter and dedication to the Eibishter. How do you get them to do that? It's by creating a reminder of how they lived their lives during their Shemittah. Remind the person, you've just spent a year invested in Torah learning, sponging in all of the things that will create fear of the Eibishter. Which then illustrates that the purpose of the mitzvah of Hakhel is to take all of the inspiration of the Shemittah year where you were divorced from the materialism of this world and infuse it into your engagement in this world. When you are out there literally working the land. That's what Rashi Dafka emphasizes by telling us this year, yes, it's the beginning of a new cycle, and it's the 8th year, meaning it's drawing on the 7th year that preceded it. The first year of the 6 years has to be not only the beginning of a new cycle, equally importantly, it has to be a continuation of the attitude of the previous year. It should feel like an 8th year that is drawing its energy from the Shemittah year of dedication to Hashem. And that's why Rashi says that the pasuk calls it Shnas Shemittah, because practically because Shemittah is still active to some extent in this year. Because as we mentioned before, it does seem a bit strange that if you're talking about the halachas of Hakhel, you're still referencing the halachas of Shemittah, which seem to have already passed. So why is it? It's not just some kind of tangential indicator of what time of the year we're talking about, what time of the agricultural cycle we're talking about, but divorced from actually being related to Hakhel. The content is in order to take this arousal and excitement and inspiration from the previous year. It tells us this year is still with a Shemittah flavor. It's still called Shemittah year. Why? Because there are halachas of Shemittah that still apply. So not only as you begin the new agricultural cycle do you still have the afterglow of the awareness and inspiration you had in the Shemittah year, but they're actual practical parts of Shemittah that are still at play. With regards to the harvests of the 7th year that you still can't eat, which means you still have some extra time where you're still invested in Torah learning because you're not harvesting your field during the harvest period. That's what Rashi is telling us, which also raises a fascinating halachic perspective. So the incredible halachic innovation is this. This principle that Hakhel has to be after the Shemittah year, raises a question, what about nowadays? when there isn't a Torah obligation to keep Shemittah? Is there an obligation to have Hakhel? Is the Torah just indicating to us which year in the cycle is the Hakhel year, the 8th year? The year after Shemittah. Or is the Torah telling us, because it associates it specifically with Shemittah, that Hakhel is only relevant if Shemittah is being observed as it should be observed? There's a very practical distinction. In the time of the second Beis Hamikdash, according to those opinions who during the second Beis Hamikdash held that Shemittah was only D'Rabbanan. So if you're going to go with the first opinion, which is the Torah just wanted us to know which year it is that you have Hakhel, they would have had to do Hakhel in the second Beis Hamikdash mid-de'oraisa. Whereas according to the second opinion, which is you only do Hakhel when you're doing Shemittah min ha-Torah, then they had no Torah requirement to do Hakhel, because there's no Torah requirement to keep Shemittah, there's no Torah requirement to have Hakhel. So what does Rashi hold? What we've explained with Rashi, particularly the end of his explanation, where he says, "Why is the period of Hakhel still called Shnas Shemittah? Because the laws of Shemittah apply at the time of Hakhel." That implies that Rashi's view is that Hakhel is a direct continuation of Shemittah. That implies that in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Hakhel, that is contingent on fulfilling the mitzvah of Shemittah as mandated by the Torah. Although you could also argue that even though Shemittah in the second Beis Hamikdash might have been considered D'Rabbanan, it might still be enough reason to do Hakhel min ha-Torah. Why? Because practically they still do Shemittah. Even today we do Shemittah. So practically Shemittah still happened. And you could say that if practically there was a Shemittah, then there is a halacha that you have to have Hakhel. As we find in other areas of halacha, that it is possible to have a kinyan which is only acceptable midrabanan, and yet it could have an impact on a mitzvah which is required d'oraisa, like a lulav, as an example. Okay, what about on a deeper, more spiritual level? What we have to understand at a deeper spiritual level is as follows. The purpose of Shemittah, as described in the Torah, is the Torah doesn't tell us that the purpose of Shemittah is that people should have free time to learn Torah, even though that is practically what happened. It's not how the Torah describes it. The Torah says that the purpose of Shemittah is to give the land a break, that you don't actually work your fields and your vineyards. Which will then have an impact on the other 6 years when you are actually working your field. As the Sefer HaChinuch says, because once we've had a Shemittah, it reminds us that even when we are working, nothing is in our control, it's all in the Eibishter's hands. It's a reminder that the Eibishter is the balabas over everything that exists, including the things that I have and that I work with, as many of the commentators point out in detail. Therefore, having gone through a Shemittah and recognizing that I'm not in control, that this is the Eibishter's world, that these are the Eibishter's things, then even when I'm out there dealing with the world, I do so with a dedication to the Eibishter and a recognition that the Eibishter's in control. Now that we have seen how the Torah is absolutely clear that Hakhel has to be in the season of Shemittah, that implies that implies that Hakhel is taking the awakening, the inspiration of Shemittah, and schlepping it into the years that we're going to be invested in the world. That means the awakening, the arousal, this big gathering of Hakhel is to take the message of Shemittah into the 6 years. Okay, so the question is, where do you see that in Hakhel? Where do you see this theme in Hakhel? So the answer is, look at what they had to do at Hakhel, specifically what the king had to read from the Torah, and that will align with the principles of Shemittah, and as we'll see in a moment, there's actually 3 principles of Shemittah. If you want to understand what's going on over here, let's pay attention to which parts of the Torah the king had to read publicly at Hakhel, as the Mishnah points out in Soita. First, from Dvarim until Shema, then Shema V'Olim Shamoya, Aser to Aser, Kisachal El Aser, which are about the Meisers that you're supposed to give, Brachas Klolis and Parshas HaMelech, Osima Olai Melech, and then the Brachas and Klolis and Parshas Kisavai, and the mitzvah to have a king. Why those parashiyos? Well, let's first work out what is Shemittah all about. It has three themes. Mitzvah Shemittah mischalekes bichlolus lishleisha inyonim. The mitzvah Shemittah is in three categories. Aleph shvisas ha'adam. First is, as people, we have to rest during the Shemittah, which means we are forbidden from working the land in order that we could be completely dedicated to learning Torah and dedication to Hashem, etc., as we've already discussed. Number two, base shvisas ha'aretz. There's also a mitzvah that the land has to rest. V'shav ha'aretz Shabbos l'Hashem, like the pasuk says, that the land will rest. And why is that? Because there's no work happening on the land. Nobody's working the land, so the land is resting. It's literally a year-long Shabbos for the land. But then there's another thing. Gimel. Any produce that does grow during Shemittah, is nobody's. It's completely open season for whoever chooses to take it. And the owner of the field may not lay claim to any of the things that grew in his field during Shemittah. Now, what's the purpose of Shemittah, as we've already seen from the Sefer HaChinuch? Why do we have a Shemittah? To evidence the fact that everything belongs to the Eibishter. So the three facets of Shemittah illustrate three areas of the Eibishter's control. Let's start with the person. The fact that an individual farmer may not work his field during Shemittah shows that the Eibishter is the authority over that individual. I'm not here just to work my field and make money. I'm here to serve the Eibishter. Which teaches us, as long as a Jewish person is engaged with materialistic activity, it's very possible that we get caught up in the stuff that we're doing, earning a living or whatever it is, and forget why we're here. We could forget that we're here as the Eibishter's servants, and we're supposed to be completely focused on and dedicated to doing what the Eibishter wants. Because we could lose our way. Every 6 years, the Eibishter gives us a year. In that year, a Jewish person has to pull back from the materialism of this world and completely invest in spiritual avodah, which would illustrate clearly what life is all about, dedication to Hashem. And having this experience of pulling back from the world and investing what the Eibishter wants, that empowers the person going forward, that in the next 6 years where he has to work again, he'll be conscious that I'm not just filling my bank account, I'm serving the Eibishter. And the person will do their day-to-day activities for the Eibishter's sake. And even beyond that, to the extent that every single thing that they're doing is da'ehu, awareness of Hashem. So that's the value of shvisas ha'adam. That I rest helps me calibrate my thinking for when I'm not resting, when I'm working. Shvisas ha'aretz madgishes ba'alis HaKadosh Baruch Hu la'aretz. The fact that we let the land lie fallow, that reminds us that the Eibishter is in control of the land. Which includes the nature of how the land should work, and that's something you see clearly in Shemittah. From which you can extrapolate out that the Eibishter controls all of nature. Okay, like the pasuk tells us, you're going to say, what are we going to eat in the 7th year? We're not harvesting, we're not planting. Says the Eibishter, the Eibishter says, I'll give you a bracha in the 6th year that you'll have such a bounty that you'll be able to eat even into the 8th year. You'll eat for 3 years. If you were following the laws of nature, the only way things grow is if somebody plowed and somebody planted. Whereas in the Shemittah year, the Eibishter shows us there's another set of rules. That the way that things grow in the ground is not because the ground has an inherent power to make things grow. Because in that case, it would be completely dependent on plowing and planting. Ella, rather, what happens during Shemittah, we realize that the Eibishter is the one who gives you the power to be able to succeed. And if the Eibishter wants, then produce can grow in an unnatural way. To the extent that 1 year's worth of planting, the 6th year, should be powerful enough to be able to last for 3 years. That will help a person realize and feel into the 6 years where he is in the world, plowing, planting, investing. Then he realizes, actually, look at this. It's clear that the bracha is the Eibishter's bracha. It's not a natural result of me putting an effort in the field, therefore I have yield. And lastly, is the third part of Shemittah, which is that the produce is ownerless. Well, that's an indicator that it's ownerless from human ownership, because the Eibishter is the true owner of every single asset that we have. Even after the Eibishter has blessed a person with resources. The lesson is, even when the Eibishter has given us things, they still belong to him. A person could think, yes, it's true, only the Eibishter gives the bracha for my field to yield the produce. And the reason that I have produce is not because I've worked hard, nor is it because there's some kind of nature invested in this world. But once that bracha has already happened, and the produce has already grown, and now it's in my granary, my investment has already yielded results. Looks like the Eibishter gave it to me now. The Eibishter made it, and now it's mine. And seeing as I'm here to serve the Eibishter, or the other version, I'm here for no other reason other than to serve the Eibishter, or maybe even I'm not even here except to serve the Eibishter. So obviously I have to use the things that I have, my resources, to serve the Eibishter. I should use it for Kedusha purposes, or at least to be able to serve the Eibishter. But I could still have an attitude, it's my resources that I am designating for the Eibishter. That's the third lesson of Shemittah. To teach that a Jewish person has to know, I have no authority even over the resources that the Eibishter already gave me. How do we express that? Once in every 7 years, all of the produce that my field produced is not mine. That reminds a person that even in the other 6 years where I'm allowed to take that produce and put it into my granary, it's not because I'm given independent authority over those things. But these are things that the Eibishter gave me, so to speak, on loan in a sense, or at least to look after on his behalf. The Eibishter gave me these resources so that I should be a reliable representative and agent doing what the Eibishter wants. Now that we know that those are the three major teachings of Shemittah, we could see how it links to Hakhel. Here's the link between Hakhel and the details of Shemittah. And all these three messages of Shemittah, which is Shvisas Adam, Shvisas Haaretz, and Mashpeh Shvis and Hakhel, that I as a person may not work the field may not be worked, and the produce has to be ownerless. Represents that the Eibush is in control, is my authority, is in control of the world, including nature, and everything of mine belongs to the Eibishter. That is part of the message of the Parashas of Hakhel. Parasha Shema v'Yoyim Shamoya v'Aser Ta'aser v'Chischal L'Aser. How do they all? So it's going to be Shema v'Yoyim Shamoya, and then the other two. But Parasha Shema Medubar Desavidas Ruchne Shel Yehudi. Shema is all about my spiritual responsibilities. Kabbalas Malch Shomayim, that have to accept the Eibishter's authority. Limud Torah, v'shenatim levanecha, right, to learn Torah. V'kim ha-mitzvahs tefillin u'mezuzah, to fulfill mitzvahs represented by tefillin u'mezuzah. V'zeu v'hesem inyan orishan anal b'shmita, shvisas ha'adam, which aligns with the theme of the human resting during Shemittah. K'desh yuchal liyosponen l'haktish atzmo li'onyonim meruchnim kanal. As a reminder, I am here to serve the Eibishter. The parashas vayim shemayim meduber al zeh shal yidei shemayim tishmu gomer, o azay v'nosat mitatzchem b'itoy v'gomer v'safta digonecho gomer. The second parasha of Shema describes the correlation between us doing what the Eibishter wants and the brachas coming into our fields, the rains, etc. And if we don't play ball, then chas v'shalom we'll lose those brachas. That reminds us, like the second theme of Shemittah, that Eibishter controls the world and the nature of the world. Therefore, my physical resources to be able to gather the produce and put it in my storehouses is dependent. It's not a result of how much I plowed and planted. It's directly dependent on me fulfilling what the Eibishter wants. And then the third part is the parashas Aser Ta'aseh v'Chitzchal Aser, the two last parashas, Mudgesh Nechasav Shel Yehudim and B'Yodai Kipikot Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Those remind us that our things are not ours. We have to give them to others. We're not in control. How do I know that? Because look, I have to give away part of what I've hard earned. Some of them goes to the poor, some goes to the Kohanim and Levim. That's the same theme as the produce during Shemittah, which is ownerless, it's not mine. Once you have those three themes, then you understand why the last thing is the parasha that the king reads, and also the fact that it's the king who's reading all these parashas. Then we conclude with the parashas HaMelech, or Kriyas Kol HaParashas Afhi Alidei HaMelech, and in fact all the parashas are read by the king. Why? That awareness that me, my things, the world are completely the Eibishter's. That consciousness, nothing is mine, it's all the Eibishter's. Nothing is nature, it's all the Eibishter's. That consciousness is created by the king. Because the primary goal of a king, as the Tzemach Tzedek says in great detail, mitzvahs min hamelech in derech mitzvasechu, the king's role is to instill in us acceptance of Hashem's authority and fear of the Eibishter. Until a person feels absolute bittul, where there's no scope for anything other than the Eibishter, as the Tzemach Tzedek explains in derech mitzvasechu. And that will also explain why it is, as Rashi pointed out, that the linkage between Shemittah and Hakhel is specifically in the sense that it is the rules of Shemittah that apply still in Hakhel, and which rule in particular? The rule that the produce of Shemittah is still off limits, because this realization that the Eibishter runs the world, the natural processes of the world, etc. That's something you're going to anyway have in the 8th year. Why? Because as we already said, in the 8th year you're still eating produce that came from the 6th year. Like the pasuk says. You'll plant in the 8th year, and you'll still be eating the old produce until into the 9th year when you can eat the produce from the 8th year. Which means very clearly, even in the 8th year, you're seeing that the Eibishter is running the world, that nature is in Hashem's hands. But in order to see not only that the nature of the world is controlled by Hashem, which you can still see clearly in the 8th year, but to realize that we are under Hashem's authority and our assets are not ours. That's why there's another facet of the 8th year, which Rashi points out, that the rules against eating the produce of the previous year still apply. That even now, it's no longer the Shemitah year, and I still don't have authority over my own produce in my own field. That reminds the person that everything belongs to the Eibishter, which is the message of Shemittah, which is the inspiration of Hakhel, which we're supposed to carry on into the rest of the 6 years, so we know how to serve the Eibishter when we're invested in materialism. So when it's that time of the year where a person, or that time of the cycle where a person feels the message of Shemittah, firstly, because you can see, even now, the Eibishter is feeding me, sustaining me. As well as realizing, I'm not in control, I don't even have the stuff from my own field. And he doesn't have the authority to pick his own fruit from his own field. That's the most appropriate time to now read the messages that the king is going to convey to the community in Hakhel, which will have this very profound, meaningful impact on the person for the coming 6 years. To the extent that we'll learn during the Hakhel year how to serve the Eibishter, to realize we are not in control of ourselves. We do not determine the outcomes of our investments. It's an Eibishter who runs the world and the nature within that world, and that our assets don't belong to ourselves, and therefore we'll be in a state of awe of Hashem all of our lives, not only for the next 6 years, but in the long term and permanently. And with Hashem, very soon we should be able to see that begolei mamash. Firstly, doing Hakhel as it is intended with the King Melech HaMashiach, reading the Hakhel, and secondly, recognizing that the Eibishter is in control of everything by seeing the Eibishter revealed with Mashiach now.